I really do love myself an affordable gaming monitor, and today we're looking at the Philips Evnia 27 M2N 5500, which sports a flat 27-inch IPS panel, a resolution of 1440p and a refresh rate of up to 180Hz, has adaptive sync technologies and also display HDR400 certification. It is touted to come out in the UK at roughly £240. Now in this video, which has been sponsored by the manufacturer, I'll be covering everything you need to know about it so that you can make your own informed purchasing decision. Now to kick things off, I thought I should talk about connectivity because it's important for you to achieve the maximum refresh rate and resolution. The monitor has got a singular DisplayPort 1.4 input and two HDMI 2.0 ports. The former will allow you to achieve 1440p at 180Hz, however the latter will cap you at 144Hz. Just worth bearing in mind if you intend to use this monitor over an HDMI connection. Now with the monitor connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, I went ahead and did my tests. And first off, its input lag clocked in at 0 milliseconds, which I know is hard to believe, but I can only share the figures that I was able to attain via my own testing methodology. Indeed, it does a tremendous job in this department, and therefore means if you're a hardcore competitive gamer, you're not going to have to worry about the slightest input lag that's going to be affecting your mouse clicks, or of course, if for example, you're using a controller. Now it's worth pointing out here that this figure was attained with the low input lag mode enabled via the monitor's OSD. I don't actually know why you'd ever want to disable it. However, it's worth highlighting over here that the monitor's low input lag mode does become grayed out if you have adaptive sync technologies enabled. In other words, AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Now subjectively, I didn't notice much of a difference when it was actually grayed out, but it's just something I thought I should highlight in this video. Now aside from its input lag, what about when it comes to its response time, which is equally important when it comes to hardcore competitive gaming? Well, here there are a few different overdrive modes that you can select via the monitor's OSD. Off, fast, faster and fastest. The higher you go, the faster the monitor's response time will be, but as a caveat, you will actually get a lot more inverse ghosting. In other words, purple trailing that goes behind certain objects. Now for me to actually demonstrate this, I'm using the OSRTT tool. And with the overdrive set to off, you can see that the average initial time sits at 6.94 milliseconds. This translates to the average D2G that the manufacturer claims. Now if we move over to the fast mode preset, you can see that this time does improve slightly at 6.48 milliseconds. But where things become a bit more interesting is on the faster mode preset with an average time of just 4.78 milliseconds, with the percent window sitting at a respectable 76.67%, or 77% to round it up, at 180Hz refresh rate window. Now I'd also like to draw your attention towards the middle of your screen where you've got the RGB overshoot. And as you can see over here, it's pretty much all green, and this is on the faster mode preset. Now if we were to switch over to the fastest mode preset, you can see that suddenly you've got a lot more error. In other words, a lot more red on your screen. On the flip side here, you will have a much better average initial time of just 2.4 milliseconds, with the percent in window sitting at a very impressive 97%. Now the recommended mode that I would use for this monitor is actually the faster mode preset, because you have not got any inverse ghosting, and it means that this monitor is actually usable in said mode. Now the same sort of experiences were actually noted when I was actually playing a game such as Counter-Strike 2, wherein that on the fastest mode preset there was just too much inverse ghosting that was occurring, and therefore means that on the faster mode preset I was able to get a bit of a slower response time, but on a flip side a much better visual experience, and one that was actually pleasurable no matter what sort of game I was actually playing. To further expand on that, you can see the UFO ghosting test, and yes indeed you can see towards the lighter shades on the fastest mode preset that there is some inverse ghosting. Again, that's the trailing that occurs behind an object and can be noticeable in certain scenes. Now you have also got an MBR mode, which stands for Motion Blur Reduction. It's great to see that the Motion Blur Reduction mode can be tailored with the different overdrive modes. You're not actually locked, which is actually quite a novelty. In this respect, you can see that this image was taken with the faster mode preset, which is my recommended preset, with MBR. And yes, the UFO becomes a lot clearer and therefore aids motion clarity. Speaking of which, over here, the overall motion clarity of this IPS monitor is relatively good, as you'll be able to hopefully see via the UFO ghosting test, and you've also got that 180Hz refresh rate, which gives you a little bit of extra fluidity over the likes of 144Hz, or of course a massive jump over the likes of a 60Hz panel. So something worth considering if you're looking at upgrading your monitor to this Philips Evnia One. Now on a side, I would just like to point out that MBR can be used at the maximum refresh rate of 180Hz, 144Hz, and also 120Hz. However, it will not operate at 60Hz and will not also run simultaneously with adaptive sync technologies. In other words, AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. Now, this does actually perfectly bring me onto VRR technologies, in other words AMD FreeSync or NVIDIA G-Sync. And in this respect, the monitor has not got a native G-Sync module, and as such has got a VR range from 48 up to 180Hz. Now I was able to run it on the NVIDIA Pendulum demo while connected over DisplayPort to my RTX 3080, and I didn't incur any sort of flickering or black screen issues. Furthermore, I was able to run a game such as Destiny 2 while running HDR simultaneously at 1440p at 180Hz with NVIDIA G-Sync enabled. All the technologies worked in tandem and I had no problems whatsoever. Now this does actually bring me on to its overall HDR performance. And the monitor has got Display HDR 400 certification, therefore won't compete with some higher echelon monitors out there which cost significantly more with HDR 600 or above, or of course mini LED technology. Nonetheless, the monitor's HDR color accuracy was actually pretty impressive, and therefore means that it's something that you might want to utilize if you do have access to playing an HDR enabled game or of course a movie. Now equally over here, HDR might be of importance for console gamers, and this does actually lead me onto the console capabilities of this monitor. As a reminder, it's got those HDMI 2.0 ports, but thankfully means that you'll get 120Hz at 1440p. You can of course run 1080p if you so wish, or 60Hz. Now in terms of the overall performance at 120Hz, on the recommended faster mode preset, you can see over here the average initial time sat at 4.22 milliseconds, with a percent in Windows sitting at 97%, therefore hitting the 120Hz refresh rate range very well. On its fastest mode preset, yet again, you've got a lot more RGB overshoot, as you'll see towards the middle of your screen, but you will also get a faster average initial time of 2.77 milliseconds. At 60Hz on the faster mode preset, you can see here the average initial time sits at 4.1 milliseconds, with the percent in window at a perfect 100%, while on the fastest mode preset this drops down to 2.88 milliseconds, but yet again you've got a lot more RGB overshoot. Here you can see the UFO ghosting test, where yet again you can see on the fastest mode preset there's a lot more inverse ghosting, but on the faster mode preset it's pretty much negligible altogether, be it at 120Hz or 60Hz. And yes, you can see that MBR does actually have the same sort of capabilities. In other words, you can actually customize the overdrive settings and is plausible at 120Hz. Now, aside from this, the monitor does accept a 4K signal input, which can be handy in certain scenarios and does give it some bit of versatility. Indeed, in this respect, I've got a 4K Blu-ray player, and when connected over HDMI to this monitor, I was able to notice that this was picking up a 4K signal with HDR at 60Hz. It's effectively taking a 4K signal and downscaling it to 1440p, therefore giving you still fantastic clarity and good pixel density, in comparison to taking a 1080p signal and upscaling it to 1440p. So with the gaming section out of the way, how does the 27M2N 5500 actually look like? Well, as a reminder, you have got a flat 27-inch IPS panel, which also has got a matte coating to it. And therefore, the overall pixel density will actually be pretty good when it comes to text legibility. Now, you have also got a dedicated sRGB mode that you can select via the monitor's OSD. It's also fantastic to see that you've got full brightness controls. There is also RGB gain values, although this will override the sRGB mode, so something just worth bearing in mind, but that allows you that sort of customization. Now in the sRGB mode, I had it tested via my calibrators with a gamut coverage of 92.2% and a gamut volume of 96.4%. Below you can see how it compares to the sRGB standards. As for its average delta-E, it sits at 1.82 with a maximum delta-E of 4.71. Therefore, it could be used for some light image editing work or video grading. Its tested contrast ratio sat at 1250 to 1, with the measured white point in comparison to the 6504 Kelvin target at 5875 Kelvin at 100%. As for the gamma curve, it sits pretty close to the 2.2 standards. Now, should you want the colors to pop a little bit more, you might want to disable the sRGB mode. For example, if you're going to be gaming or watching movies. And indeed, this monitor has got a wider color gamut. And here, the gamut coverage and the volume has been positively affected in the Adobe RGB and DCI P3 color spaces. Concentrating on the latter and with the gamma set to 2.6 via the monitor's OSD, you can see that here it hits 93.5% in gamut coverage and 100.4% in gamut volume in the DCI P3 color space. Below you can see how it compares as well. As for the average delta-E and maximum delta-E, it sits at 1.98 and 13.05 respectively. Therefore, it cannot be used for image editing work or video grading, at least in the DCI P3 color space. Its tested contrast ratio does not shift. However, its measured white point does slightly move at 5869 Kelvin at 100%. As for its gamma performance, at least in comparison to the 2.6 standard, which is required for the DCI P3 color space, it is actually relatively close yet again. Past the overall color performance, what about when it comes to brightness? Well, here in HDR I clocked in 449 nits, therefore sufficing to display HDR 400 criteria. You have also got a maximum SDR brightness of 388 nits, while in the sRGB mode it does slightly drop to 380 nits. Therefore meaning that this monitor can be used in a bright sunlit room, and indeed it is plenty bright. I was often using the monitor at roughly 60 to 70% brightness. As for its minimum brightness, however, it is relatively high at 87 nits, so something worth considering if you're going to be using this in a completely pitch black environment. As for the motion blur reduction modes, you have got 20 level increments to choose from, and at its maximum level, it will lock the brightness at 138 nits. Speaking about luminance, I should talk about brightness uniformity. I do appreciate it's somewhat panel lottery, but you'll be able to see how my tested panel performed across the board, where it does actually go a little bit off towards the edges. As for the overall backlight bleed, here are the images that were taken in a completely pitch black environment with the monitor set at 100% brightness. So next up we should talk about its build quality, and here you've got a three-side ballless design with a relatively thin bottom bezel. You've also got a power LED which can be actually disabled via the monitor's OSD. Now, the monitor stand is actually made in part of recycled material, which is certainly appreciated. It's also very sturdy and provides you height, tilt, swivel and pivot adjustment. In fact, you can rotate it both ways, which gives it good sort of versatility. If you do want to replace the built-in stand, you can do so via VESA-compatible stand, allowing you to mount it on a monitor arm or a multi-monitor setup. Now past this, at the back right-hand side of the monitor, you will notice a small little joystick button, and this is to access the monitor settings, in other words the OSD. Now the OSD itself is very comprehensive and allows you all the right options. Although it's worth bearing in mind, it does actually take a little bit of getting used to, in other words how to navigate it. It also has a white and purple contrast to it, therefore means that in some instances it can be hard to see what you're actually selecting. Nonetheless, via the monitor's OSD you will be able to notice that there is a volume setting. Here this is to control the volume output via the 3.5mm headphone jack, therefore allowing you to plug in headphones directly onto the monitor. The reason I highlight this is because the monitor does not have any sort of built-in speakers. So there we have it. Hopefully you've enjoyed my detailed overview of the Philips Evnia 27 M2N 5500. I'd be curious to know what you make of it down in the comment section below. And if you have enjoyed this video, definitely do consider dropping a like, subscribing and hitting that bell notification, all of which would be greatly appreciated. As such, I've been Totally Dubbed and I'll hopefully see you in the next one. Take care of yourselves and goodbye.